This is the You Can Learn Chinese podcast, part of the Seneca Network from the China Project. For everyone who's trying to learn Chinese or reaching for the next level, you came to the right place. I'm your host, Jared Turner, co-founder of the Mandarin Companion Graded Reader Series, longtime resident of China. And I usually don't have time to study, but when I do, I don't. My co-host is John Pasden, co-founder of Mandarin Companion, founder of All Set Learning, the Chinese grammar wiki, sinosplice.com, and for his New Year's resolution, he gave up gambling for good. Now, he only gambles for evil. So, you want to read Chinese literature? John and I are going to talk about the unique aspects of Chinese literature that you should know before jumping in. Guest interviews with Christina Duffy, a PhD rowing champion from Ireland turned Chinese learner. Let's get to it. Hey guys, this is Jared Turner coming at you from Utah in the United States.
Hello listeners, I am John Pasden. I am based in Shanghai, China.
All right, John, we have got a listener review before we kick in today. This comes from I don't know how this is pronounced, but it says, she says, he, she says, so helpful. Love to hear these guys talking about the learning process. Definitely a podcast to tune into if you're serious about learning Chinese. Hey, well, we appreciate that. Me. So go ahead, and if anyone else, you got a review, drop us one wherever you write reviews.
Thank you. We can use them.
And John, we also have a listener question. This comes from Dre. Maybe it's Dr. Dre. I'm just going to call you Dr. Dre. Okay, he says, hey guys, love the show. Been learning Chinese for a while. And he has a question about the Zhuyin system that's used in Taiwan. He says it's an alternative form for pinyin. It spells out Chinese characters phonetically with a very simple one or two stroke characters for each initial and final sound. This breaks away from the Latin alphabet used in pinyin and can help getting with the mental mode right. Too often, I see pinyin and try to read it in English before mentally correcting myself in Chinese. Additionally, I use a lot of Taiwanese books, and road signs use Zhuyin alongside Chinese characters to help with spelling out new words. And some signs are fully in Zhuyin, which might be excellent for beginners. Seems like the closest thing we have to a Chinese alphabet. But, he says, it seems like Zhuyin has a fairly minimal resources for learning, and it mainly is used with traditional characters being used in Taiwan. What do you guys think? Does this have a chance at being used as a quote-unquote a better pinyin for beginners if it had more love and resources? Or am I just getting distracted and I should get back to my studies? With love, Dre, Dr. Dre. Well, John, you know a lot more about this Zhuyin system. Maybe you could tackle this one for Dr. Dre.
All right. Yeah, I've talked with people about this a lot over the years. It's also called the Bo Po Mo Fo system in Taiwan. And to answer your question, no, it doesn't really have a lot of chance of becoming like widely used as a better system. But I know a lot of people, usually in Taiwan, focused on Taiwanese, Chinese, that love it. And they swear it's so much better than pinyin. And the main reason is, like you mentioned, because it's not in the Latin alphabet, your eye is not immediately drawn to it or tempted to pronounce the pinyin like it's English. And so it's not nearly as distracting. You can focus on the characters unless you need these symbols to help you sound it out. So it's a little bit like Japanese can have like little kana above the characters. It's kind of like that. But they're different symbols. They look a little bit like some Japanese kana. But, each character has its own, almost like diacritics.
They're like runic scrawlings, above or next to the character.
Yeah, you can look them up. They look kind of Chinese, kind of Japanese, but also kind of weird. But anyway, bottom line is if you're in Taiwan, you can definitely use them. You can find them in books. You can find them on signs. If you're not in Taiwan, it's not used a whole lot, and pinyin is pretty much taking over. I hear a lot of people saying that pinyin is taking over on signs and stuff in Taipei, and maybe other places might follow. So I know that makes some people sad, but that's just kind of the way it's going. So you can use it if you want, if you're in Taiwan, but I definitely wouldn't try to use it if I'm not in Taiwan.
I will say, John, I think one reason that a lot of foreigners do like this is simply because it doesn't use the Latin alphabet, right? Because, if you see letters above the character, you're drawn to read those. But with the, as we're describing the Zhuyin system, it's not letters and alphabets that we're used to seeing.
Right, but if you get too attached to it and you want to use it for everything, you'll find it quite limiting because it's just not that widely used.
Well, Dr. Dre, hope that answers your questions. And if anyone else has a question for us, for the podcast, please drop us a line. You can find us at mandarincompanion.com or send us an email at feedback@mandarincompanion.com.
All right, so let's get into today's topic. Today we're going to talk about something that I don't think we've talked about much after over 100 podcasts, but it's something that some of my friends and some of our past guests hold very dear to their hearts, and that is Chinese literature and getting to the point where you can read Chinese literature.
Yeah, so fair warning, this may not be the best podcast for all you beginners out there, but it will help you understand what's involved if and when you decide you want to get into some native, authentic Chinese literature.
Yeah, so we'll just say that up front. It's a long road. I mean, you got to learn everything else, and then you got to start learning a whole bunch more, forms of writing for Chinese literature. And of course, there are different genres that span the centuries, the millennia even. So you might want to specialize. But anyway, it's a whole nother advanced level that goes beyond HSK 6.
So I think it's important to preface this whole subject with, illustrating how Chinese people learn Chinese. Now, it's a lot. It's not for the faint of heart. John and I both have kids. John's kids right now are in the Chinese educational system, well, kind of, right? But mine went through those as well, and it's almost like drinking from a fire hose, right, John?
Yeah, you learn a lot of characters. But before we go fully into the Chinese side of the equation, let's just remember, like for those of us that are native speakers of English, like how we learned English in class, and then how we started learning English literature. Because when you're a native speaker of English, yeah, you got to learn to grammatically analyze your language. What's a noun? What's a verb? What's an adjective? But you don't spend a lot of time, trying to learn to create grammatical sentences because as a native speaker, you're already pretty good at that. You just have to maybe, eradicate a few bad habits and learn some fancy patterns that make your writing sound more sophisticated. But pretty early on, you start getting into literature. And that's pretty typical for any, language class when it's your native language.
Definitely. So, here in the States, it's usually first grade. You have some very simple books to read, and they'll progress in little complexity as you move along. But definitely by third grade, you should be reading, most schools are having their students and focusing on reading like chapter books and so forth. When we get into the Chinese educational system, it's a little more advanced than that.
Yeah, it's funny, like in the U.S., you start reading chapter books, like you said, third grade or fourth grade or something like that. But like, when do you get into Shakespeare? Like that's going to be a while, right?
Definitely.
And then when you think of the Chinese side, it's like, oh, they have to learn all those characters. Like they must have to wait a really long time before they really start getting into any kind of difficult literature, right?
And the answer is no. We start that pretty early in the Chinese educational system.
Yeah, so as early as first and second grade, kids are like memorizing classical Chinese poetry.
Mm-hmm.
And the language used in the poetry is not the same as the spoken language. Some of the words are archaic, and so the kids don't really understand it until the teacher explains it, but they still have to memorize it, and they have to learn what all these different poems mean.
So it's important to realize that in the Chinese educational system, the first 5 years of your elementary education are primarily focused on acquiring characters and essentially learning to read, to be literate in the language. And because it is a challenge, to get all those characters down. So they're cycling through roughly 700 characters a school year, to help the students learn that and get to the point where they can now be able to have a level of competency to encounter and read most Chinese they're going to encounter anywhere in their life.
Well, it's not, but it's not 700 in grade 1. But yeah, anyway, they're amassing tons of characters.
It's about 650, but then so it varies a little bit year to year. But you're right, that's the general idea to keep in mind, that they're amassing a lot of characters every day and throughout the entire school year.
But that doesn't mean that they're waiting to get into Chinese literature.
Nope.
So there's the poetry. There's the classic stories that come from hundreds or even thousands of years ago. It might be kind of rewritten in sort of a semi-modern form. Anyway, they get into that stuff early.
So if you were to get one of the textbooks, if you will, from the class for learning Chinese in Chinese schools, from even the second year, and you were starting to look through this and realize the topics and the subjects that they're covering, you'd be like, wow, this is pretty advanced, because it is.
Okay, so what's the point of all this? Why are we talking about how Chinese kids learn literature early? The point is that you can't learn like a kid. You can't like start learning literature super early on in your studies because it's not going to work well for you as a non-native speaker. And when you do finally decide, hey, I'm really interested in Chinese literature, I want to get into that, just keep in mind that it can be a little bit difficult for Chinese friends or even Chinese teachers to teach a foreigner Chinese literature, Chinese poetry, because they start so early and so few foreigners actually go that far, that it can be definitely a challenge. But once your language skills are fairly advanced, then you can also read the materials meant for younger native speakers and comprehend them. And then that's also one way to get into it.
I think just something to underscore, in discussing all this might help some of you out there who are listening understand perhaps if you've had a teacher or tutor who's tried to feed you some really advanced material early on in your studies. This is frequently because this is a bit how they were approached to learning the language and learning characters. So it's a common thing to happen. This is also another reason why it's good to find an experienced teacher who understands some of these things, that they're not trying to feed you some of these things too early.
Yeah, I think I've mentioned before in my first year of Chinese, the teacher had us memorize a couple Chinese poems. And man, I hated it because I didn't understand it. I couldn't get the tones right. It was supposed to be an exercise in tonal accuracy, but it was terrible for me. I'm much more into comprehensible input, and it was not that.
An exercise in frustration, John?
Yes, it was. And also, one other thing that I wanted to mention is if you take a 4-year degree in Chinese language and literature at a university, they always try to do what pretty much any language major does, which is teach you the basics in the language, the grammar, the vocabulary in the first 2 years, and then start getting into literature in the 3rd and 4th year. And it's really hard to do with Chinese because you have to learn all those characters as well as all the vocabulary, the grammar, the tones. And it's just a lot to cram into 4 years.
And this is important to realize because, we're talking, let's rewind a little bit, saying, 700 characters a year for these Chinese elementary school students. That ends up being 5 years, about roughly 3,500 characters, but that doesn't encompass the amount of words, right? We're just talking about characters there. And to be fluent at a native level in a language, usually you're going to know about 9,000 words. So, characters is not the whole ball game there. And to acquire, if we're going to be reading like literature in 3 years, you're looking at trying to acquire roughly, just 3,000 words a year, which is a very accelerated pace and is going to be very difficult to do for anyone but the most fully dedicated, full-time, 100% focused students.
Okay, so let's give some practical advice here. So supposing that Chinese literature intrigues you, there's probably some particular aspect of it that's especially interesting. So, for example, one of our past guests, Peter Braden, he has amazing Chinese, and he's really into classical poetry. So he also reads a lot, but poetry is kind of his thing. So he got really deep into that. One of our other past guests, Murray James, the jazz musician, he really likes to read modern literature. If your background is more on like spoken Chinese and kind of practical Chinese, making the jump to modern literature isn't quite as bad, even though there's a lot of vocabulary to learn. So you don't want to try to be like the Chinese kid who just has to learn it all. You want to pick a focus, and even though it's going to be challenging no matter what the focus is, it's definitely going to help you get into it.
And just for the record, Murray James Morrison, his episode was number 96. Do music skills make you better at Chinese? And Peter Braden, his episode was in episode 51, Behind the Scenes and Making a Mandarin Companion Graded Reader. So if you want to listen to those, you can hear them.
Cool. So there's also some pre-modern literature. So the 4 great works of Chinese literature. You know what we're talking about here, Jared?
It's, kind of. What is it? It's like a Dream of Red Chambers.
Dream of Red Chambers, Journey to the West.
Yeah, Journey to the West. 西游记. Yeah.
But also The Romance of the Three Kingdoms and Water Margin. Those are like the 4 great pre-modern works of Chinese literature. And I remember when, my Chinese was pretty decent, like maybe upper intermediate. And I was like, I can maybe take on these great works now. And they're probably kind of hard, so I'll do the simplified version for kids. And so I bought that, and it was still just so hard. It was ridiculous. So I did not go about the sequencing well. You don't go from like upper intermediate straight into those works. You want to get to the point where you can read newspapers, read modern literature, and then maybe go pre-modern. So you want to be smart about it, but it's definitely doable. It's just something that you need to know. Not everyone has the same goals. Some people want to read the newspapers. Some people want to read the WeChat messages, and some people want to go after the literature.
Yeah, John, this reminds me of how even having some Chinese friends that have been like English majors, and they've shown me what their teacher had assigned them, in their later years. And I remember one had pulled out Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. Now, it's a great book, great story, very beloved, but, Jane Austen can be difficult to read for even native speakers of English if they're not familiar with the language and the time and everything. So, that likening that to some of the literature that you may find the teachers may want to assign to you, or you may even be interested in reading when we're looking at some of these classics. But, even when we're looking at Chinese literature, there are a lot of other options as well. A lot of web novels are really popular these days. They can vary in the complexity of the reading, but they're a little bit more going to be more accessible than some of these classics.
So yeah, I agree that reading some of those web novels is a good way to go, especially if you're just starting to break into it. But there are a number of authors that are a bit more accessible, or maybe a bit more significant. So for example, one of the first ones that I read that I found to be not easy, but definitely more accessible and also not so long was Lu Xun. Like his Diary of a Madman. That's a total classic that all Chinese people know, and it's not that long. And it's not easy, but it's not that hard compared to some things like, Dream of Red Chambers. But then there are some other modern authors which write in a style which is not super hard, like Mo Yan or Ba Jin, all considered good authors, modern, but not super hard. And then if you want to get away from like the very literary acclaimed ones, there's some authors which are just kind of popular, like Han Han, the race car driver. Not everybody likes him, but his style is fairly simple and definitely modern because he's not that old. And then also the author of Santi, so his name is Liu Cixin, and he is definitely harder, but he's not like super literary. So, you have a lot of options there. Just keep in mind that because everyone has different styles, some of them are going to be harder than others. So it's definitely something you want to, kind of do a little bit of research on, ask some Chinese friends, maybe read a page here and there before you commit to 300 pages,
And I will say, John, that there are a lot of great places to find and discover some of these books. We do have an article on Mandarin Companion's website. It's titled The 6 Best Apps for Reading Chinese. And in there specifically, we mentioned like QQ Yuedu, which is a reading app by QQ, which is owned by Tencent. It also does WeChat. And you can find a whole lot of Chinese novels on there, very cheap. You can find different ratings. Now, it's all in Chinese, so it's not necessarily for the beginner. But there's also some great apps like Readaboo. We'll put the link in the show notes so you can check that out. And there's going to be a lot of links and resources within that app to like web novels. And there's a Discord channel for Chinese learners that's run by Crystal Wu, who was interviewed in our last episode, Where Chinese Words Come From. And people there are always discussing some of these different web novels. Anyway, there's a whole lot of genres of literature out there that you can discover, and that if it's appropriate for you, your level, and at your interest level, if something you want to read, there's a lot of ways to get that stuff. And frankly, getting actual Chinese books, at least electronic books and stuff, is really cheap. QQ Yedu, you can buy books. I mean, they're like 10, 30 cents, 50 cents, for ebooks and stuff.
Yeah, and as Jared mentioned, you can find these books on electronic platforms. Some of them are Chinese, which you can still access abroad. Some of them you can't. I don't know. This is a whole other topic. But one of the things that's kind of cool is some of them will let you read and then play the audio at the same time. So that's another way to kind of get into it, as long as the texts are the same. And since they're not translations, they should be the same.
So definitely there's a lot of options out there for reading. Really, I think it's about finding something that's going to be appropriate for you at that level that you're ready to start reading literature. And, I think for any learner, there's always going to be a gap, right? There's going to be a gap from what you know, what you're comfortable with, and when you're ready to actually start learning and reading authentic literature. Now, we always recommend reading at a high level of comprehension, and you should definitely try to do that as often as possible. But when you're trying to bridge that gap, it's probably not going to be fully possible to be reading at such a high level of comprehension. But you need to have at least a strong enough base so that even when you do have to look up words, and maybe sometimes you do have to look up a lot of words or characters within a sentence, but you have enough comprehension of everything else to go what's going on so that you're not totally lost.
Yeah, so again, if you're interested in Chinese literature, you can definitely do it. I know plenty of people who have done it, and they love it. It's not something that's just going to happen. You're definitely going to have to work hard at it. But if that's what you're interested in, you can definitely do it.
You can read Chinese. All right, now it's time for a word from our sponsor. And John, our sponsor is
Mandarin Companion, Chinese Graded Readers.
Today we're talking about our newest book, which is Sherlock Holmes and a Scandal in Shanghai, a level 2 graded reader.
Yeah, the Chinese name is 照片的案子 because it's kind of revolving around, because the plot kind of revolves around a photograph.
It's based on Sherlock Holmes and a Scandal in Bohemia, but we have a movie star and the son of a prominent politician who is a foreigner. It's set in about 1920s Shanghai, which during that time you had the international community was very prominent and controlled a large part of Shanghai, and they were involved in different local civic government positions. Anyway, but there's a scandal going on.
Yeah, so as you know, we take the original work about Sherlock and we adapt it into a Chinese environment for a fully Chinese context, and the result is really cool. The Gao Ming stories are quite popular, so if you're ready for level 2, 450 unique characters, this is a great story.
Definitely. So you can go out there and get it today. And good news, it is now available on Amazon Kindle. We've had some issues getting that published on there, but we just cleared all the hoops and it's now released and available for sale on Kindle. So you can go out and get it today on Amazon Kindle, iBooks, Kobo, or wherever you get your books.
And of course, it's available in print.
All right, now it's time for rants and raves. John, what do you have for us today? Do you have a rant or do you have a rave?
I have a bit of a rave rant, Jared.
Ooh, do tell.
So recently I've been getting into Chinese dramas, like these TV series. It's just really easy because I have this Xiaomi TV, and the yearly subscription is like 240 RMB, which is like less than $40, I guess. I don't know. It's pretty cheap.
Yeah, about
and
that,
so
yeah.
There's just all these like new dramas coming out all the time. And whenever I turn on the TV, they're just right there. And I hear about some of them from friends and coworkers and stuff. And so I'll just like jump into one, maybe watch one episode. If it's interesting, I'll keep going. But lately there have been a lot of pretty interesting ones. And my wife was commenting on that too. It seems like, I don't know, people are getting better at coming up with interesting plots, or maybe the censors are getting laxer in mainland China. I don't know. Like, just to give an example, I recently watched this one called 回家的女儿. So like the daughter that came home. And like the plot is about this family who a daughter went missing. But then this family years later had this housekeeper who also went missing. And she came from an orphanage, and her best friend went looking for her. So she posed as the daughter that family lost, pretending to be her like 10 years later, in order to try to find out what happened to her friend. Right? It's kind of an interesting plot. So here's where the rant comes in.
Interesting, indeed.
A lot of these stories have quite interesting setups. And like the first half is really interesting, but then they just kind of fall apart and the ending is not so good. So I feel like I've seen a lot of like the first half of these series, but then they reach a point and I'm just like, I don't care anymore. And it's still good like listening practice, and it's kind of interesting because a lot of these shows are set in like smaller towns across China. Like the one I just mentioned is set in like somewhere in southern China, like near Fujian or something, they sometimes speak in Cantonese and they have accents and stuff. So that's kind of interesting. So I feel like I'm not totally invested in the story. I'm also just kind of observing, seeing what they talk about and stuff. See these lives that are not part of my own Chinese life. But yeah, the rant is that a lot of times the endings, they don't stick the landing.
Oh, man. Well, I'm sure you could stick that landing.
Yeah, I'm not really in the business of Chinese dramas. Okay, but Jared, what do you got? Rant or rave?
Okay, I also have like a rant rave. and this is, I checked it, John. My last 12 episodes were all raves. So it's a rant rave. I thought it was just kind of funny. So it's like a rant rave. Anyway, we've been listening to Chinese New Year music in our house because, hey, the New Year is upon us. By the time this episode drops, It'll be, I think, the day after Chinese New Year?
Oh, no, I think I know where this is going.
Anyway, but we were listening to this playlist of just some random Chinese New Year songs, and as we were all listening, we were eating dinner, and as this started playing, everyone kind of stopped, and like we listened to this one part of the song, and everyone just started laughing. So I'm going to play this for you. Here we go. Okay, so that had us cracking up. It was like "Gong Xi Ni," like jingle bells. Anyway, it was just all of a sudden just Chinese New Year song, and then it busts into the tune of Jingle Bells, all Chinese New Year style with "Gong Xi Ni." And I don't know, we just thought it was utterly hilarious.
The rest of the song,
I had to go back and listen to it a few more times.
The rest of the song is not to the melody of Jingle Bells.
No, it was just like in one part of that song there, just like bust right in. And the name of the song, it's a 向歌友们拜年. So it's like, Happy New Year to my singing friends, right? But I just thought it was hilarious. If you want to talk about cultural appropriation, there we go, right there. They're stealing our Christmas songs and using them for Chinese New Year.
How dare they?
How dare they? But Happy New Year to you, John.
Happy Chinese New Year.
My name is Christina Duffy.
Christina and I met through our Mandarin Companion WeChat group.
I'm currently a senior content strategist at Amazon Web Services in Dublin, and I've been learning Chinese for nearly 4 years.
For some people, they're immediately enamored with the language, while others grow into it. Christina's story falls into the latter category, but once she decided to learn, for her, there was no turning back. Stay with us. Okay, Christina, why did you start learning Chinese?
I started learning Chinese quite randomly after 3 trips to China through my rowing club, and it came about very randomly how we were invited to those rowing trips. One of my friends, who was my housemate at the time, she received an email from her rowing coach in New Zealand, and he emailed and said they were organising the international cruise for this regatta that was happening in China, and they were looking for a crew to represent Cambridge. Now, I didn't row for Cambridge at the time, but he said, that doesn't matter, that's okay, we just need 4 people to be in the boat to represent Cambridge. And is there any chance that you could find 4 people to do this? So at the time, I'm basically the friend that people come to when there's something random and they think it's a bit crazy, so Christina will probably do it. I explained what it was, and they were going to pay for everything, fully pay for your flights,
wow,
pay for accommodation, pay for racing, food, etc. You didn't have to pay a penny.
I assume this is not normal for these types of events.
I've never heard of an event like it. I've only heard from Chinese regattas that actually do this. There's no other regatta that will sponsor the athletes to come.
Wow.
So quite unusual in that respect. So yeah, we got 4 people together. We all had to drop everything. It was in 3 weeks. China is somewhere I'd never really thought about, but I thought it just sounded really exciting. It was a huge opportunity. Definitely wanted to be involved with it. So we got 4 people. We got our Cambridge kit. They said to bring a flag. So we gathered all the equipment that we needed together, got our visas, and off we went. The regatta itself was going to be in Guangzhou, and it was over 5 days. The entire schedule was made ahead of time, and they had scheduled out every single hour what exactly we would be doing from 6 a.m. in the morning right through until 10:30 in the evening.
That sounds very scheduled. I'm curious to know, did you even bring over your own, and forgive my ignorance, boat? Did you have to bring everything?
Sometimes for regattas, you would bring your own boat. If it was an Olympics or a race, you train in your own boat, so you're very used to your own equipment, your own setup. But in this particular instance, the Chinese Rowing Association said we will provide all of the equipment. So all you need to bring is the athletes and a cox box, which is the speaker system for the cox who's telling you what to do. So when we got there, the first morning they said, okay, the first hour is you need to go and get your boats and organise your blades, which are your paddles. So it was literally a free-for-all, all these universities, University of Melbourne, Sydney, Otago, New York, a few from Britain, there was Oxford as well. And it was basically just run to the boat shed and get the best boat that you can quickly. Because there was quite a variance in quality of boat.
Oh, really?
So we ran in, tried to get the best boat you can, get the best blades we can. It was very difficult to figure out what was going on.
Was there jockeying for prime pieces of equipment at this point?
There were definitely two hands would be placed on the same piece of equipment, and then the death stare at each other. Who's going to get this? Who's going to back down first? But it worked out in the end. Each of the teams were given a translator at the airport. So when we arrived, we were greeted by the welcoming team, and they had found some English learning students from various Chinese universities to come and help us. So they were assigned to each university, and we got our little helper, and they would be able to answer a question for us. But I felt really sorry for them because the vocabulary that we were using to ask them was very rowing specific. We were asking them, have you got a 10 mil rigger jigger, and what is the outboard on this foot stretcher? And they had no idea what we were saying, so it got quite confusing.
Wow, so you went to this competition, 5 days, totally scheduled out to the minute. I'm curious to know, how was this experience overall? I mean, it was your first time to China. It sounds like a translator who, I'm sure they probably have a competent level of English, right? But it sounds like the specific things they maybe not know that you need to know for your racing. And so how did this all work out for you?
I think the first culture shock for us was the airport itself. We arrived into Guangzhou, and the sheer volume of people was just something we had never experienced before. Initially, we got off the plane and there was 2 queues. They stopped all the foreigners and they said, you have to wait over here, and they put us in a little pen. And we had no idea what was going on. And all the native Chinese people went ahead. And I think they were just waiting for everyone else to get off the plane. And then they finally let us free. And there was no order in terms of queuing up for anything. I remember there was one guy and he had all of his luggage. Not only were people pushing me out of the way, but he was ramming me from behind, trying to get past me, which normally I wouldn't mind. But I was thinking, I have a race tomorrow. I need these legs tomorrow. Don't ram my legs. But they brought us into the hotel, and all of the places I've been are very Western. I've been to America, Australia, and places around Europe. But it was so different and just really made me think that I haven't really explored this world at all. I've really been living in this tiny little bubble of people speaking English and people having cultures very similar to myself. So it was a real grounding, and wow, you really have a lot to learn in this. The regatta itself was very much to do with rowing, so there wasn't a lot of time to actually experience the Chinese culture. Rowing is a very time-intensive sport, so there's a huge amount of time spent on actually getting the equipment together, getting people out on the water, testing the equipment, coming back in, readjusting. It's well known for its faff factor. So the rowing itself, again, there wasn't a whole lot of order. I think the coach, when we got there, he said, you will know what's happening, but only after it's already happened. There wasn't a whole lot of instruction of what exactly it was that we were meant to be doing. As well as that, the instructions were all in Chinese, and they asked us, we will send you the instructions for the racing and what lane everyone is in through WeChat. But none of us had WeChat. We didn't even know what WeChat was. So we had to go and download WeChat, and then they were sending us the lane instructions, which were all in Chinese, other than we could see the numbers, and W4X means women's quad. So there was a lot of guesswork, and really I think it was more of a show than a regatta. The results weren't particularly important. I don't think that was the goal of the regatta. It was more to bring talent, I think, into the city. There was an education summit that we had to participate in later where school children could come to and we could tell our stories and inspire the kids to continue to row.
Sounds like a really cool trip, but you did mention you went back a couple more times. What happened there?
Sure. So myself and my friend Amy, who also came on this trip, we quickly realized this is amazing. We've just been flown out to China to row, which is our favorite thing to do. We really need to get our own boat club invited to this thing. So rather than racing for Cambridge and a scratch crew, we need to get our own boat club, which is Imperial Boat Club, invited. So we spent the whole 4 days basically schmoozing with the staff, drinking lots of baijiu, getting to know everyone, networking, telling them all about Imperial and all about the amazing results we've had and such an elite university and really should invite us next year. I think they just thought we were a bit funny and interesting, and luckily enough they actually did invite us the next 2 years, and it would have continued if it wasn't for COVID. Yeah, so the second trip I didn't have to row, I was coaching for that trip, and that time it was in Shangyu near Shaoxing. The third trip was the most interesting. That's myself and Amy went back again. This is in the same location near Shaoxing. At this time, we booked to have an extra week after the regatta so we could actually go and see some of China. We were coaching a men's 8 at that point. So once they had finished their racing, we had got them back to the airport. We thought, okay, now we can actually go and explore some of China and see what this amazing country is all about. 2 completely clueless girls coming over from London. So we got all of our luggage together, went down to the train station, up to the ticket office, and I was like, can we get 2 tickets to Beijing, please? And she looked at me, said, have you not booked your ticket ahead of time? And I said, oh no, we haven't booked. Can we not get a ticket today? And she said, oh, it's completely booked out. So we thought, oh no, what are you going to do? And she said, there are 2 tickets left, but they're in the special VIP business class. We thought, so how much is that going to be? And she said, like 2,500 yuan, something crazy. And I had just taken out some money at the ATM that I thought would pay for the entire week ahead of us. And it ended up there was no other way we were going to get there. My friend Amy didn't have any cash, so I ended up spending all of my money on these 2 tickets to get ourselves to Beijing. But we got into the train, had these amazing kind of pod seats. They gave us free slippers, came around with snacks that we could eat. And it was quite relaxing. We did enjoy it.
You can commiserate in luxury, right?
We commiserated in luxury, yeah. Our next mission was, we hadn't actually booked anywhere to stay. We were meant to arrive at about midnight, so it was not ideal to be wandering around looking for a hotel. So we tried to go online and you couldn't get on the Wi-Fi because you needed to have a Chinese telephone number. So we asked the server and he was like, no, I'm sorry, you need a telephone number. We said, we need to find somewhere to stay. We're going to be stranded in Beijing. And this really kind businessman who was sitting in the seat opposite, he heard the commotion behind him and he said, oh, you can use my phone number. And he gave us his phone number and we booked our hotel. So
I will have to say, Christina, I've been in that situation where it's like, you got to have the phone number, right, to verify all sorts of things. And it's sometimes navigating Chinese websites to even try to book stuff. And I've been, you arrive like really late and nothing's open. Like, So,
yeah.
Okay, so you were able to book something. You got there midnight. What happened?
So we got there and we looked at the booking that we had made on the phone and the address was all in Chinese. So we asked some nice people and they told us to get off at this tube station, this underground, and we got off there and finally we made it to our hotel. So it was all good. We made it in the end.
Fantastic. Big city is always not necessarily the cheapest place to be. So how did you navigate the rest of your trip here with very limited funds?
We walked everywhere. I think totaling more than 40,000, 45,000 steps every day. We refused to take any sort of transport that involved money. We were just eating fruit that we could afford. But one of our trips, we wanted to go to the Forbidden City. So we were about a 40, 50-minute walk from there where we were staying. So we woke up in the morning. It was a nice day. So we just wore shorts, T-shirts. And about 5 minutes into our walk there, it starts lashing rain, absolutely downpour from the heavens. So we're like, we're not going to get a taxi. We've committed to this walk now. We're just going to walk. By the time we got there, we were so cold. I don't think I've ever been so cold. absolutely perished. We queued through the queues to get into the Forbidden City, went through the passport checks. And by the time we got in there was kind of a welcoming person, and they give you a little map to show you where to go around. And at that point, all we wanted to do was find a cafe just to stand inside the door and try and warm up. So we were trying to say, where is the cafe? Where is the cafe? And I think they were a bit disgusted that these foreigners had come into like one of the greatest treasures of China, and the first thing we want to do is the cafe. So we finally found the cafe, and we said, okay, we'll just sit inside until we can warm up here. My friend, she had brought a book in her back bag, so she starts reading away, and about 20 minutes later, I just turned to her and I asked, can I borrow your bag and just put it on my legs to keep my legs warm? And I was deadly serious, but it just was so funny at the time that we could not stop laughing at the ridiculous of the situation that we had got ourselves into.
Wow, that sounds crazy. One thing I know about Beijing is you see these city blocks on a map and you're like, oh, that's just a city block. They're huge city blocks.
Sure.
It sounds like you guys had quite an adventure there. But I'm curious to know, like, at this stage, what level was your Chinese? I'm assuming you probably at this point know ni hao, right? But
not even. It was non-existent.
Oh, really? So you didn't even know ni hao, right?
No, we were absolutely going in blind.
Oh, wow.
It was quite embarrassing looking back on it. But we still got around. We did quite well. I loved the amount of public toilets that they had. But rowers, like myself and my friend, we're all quite tall. Rowers are pretty tall. We're both nearly 6 foot. So they have these stalls around them. But even when you squat down, you could still see our heads over the stalls. So there was no privacy at all.
So you went around China, I guess, for this next week. And did you purposely try to learn any Chinese words at that point?
No, surprisingly not. At that point, I felt it's not something that's within my reach at all. It's completely impossible. It's just something that Chinese people can do and no one else can learn Chinese.
What happened where something changed in your mind, where you decided, hey, wait a second, I want to go ahead and try to learn this language, and I think it's actually possible to do?
So that was when I came back from the third trip. About 3 or 4 days later, I injured my back, and it was a really bad injury, and I couldn't even walk. I basically had to lie on a wooden floor with my knees curled up into my chest for about 2 weeks. Couldn't walk anywhere.
Was this in China or after you got back?
This is when we got back in London.
Oh, okay.
So I got back and I thought, oh, I wonder how that Chinese language works. I should just Google that and see exactly how it works. And that first sentence that I read just changed everything for me. And it was basically just saying that each character is 1 syllable. And I don't know why, but that just hit me like a ton of bricks. I suddenly could understand, oh, there's actually order to this. So at the time I was thinking the characters are just pictures. So I was thinking, oh, if that's the case, then Beijing must be 2 pictures, right? So I go into Google Maps, I'm like, scroll. Where's Beijing? And there it is. And it's 2 little pictures, 2 characters. And I just felt like I have cracked the Chinese language before I'd even learned 1 word, just to know that, oh, there is actually order to this. It's actually possible.
Wow.
So I went from that into Duolingo, which was the easy way in. And even on that first day, I remember thinking to myself, this is my life now. I'm going to be learning Chinese every single day for the rest of my life until I can master this as well as I can. And since that day, I have been learning Chinese every single day and have not once been bored.
I want to know a little more here, Christina, because like, all right, you said, oh, okay, this language is figure-outable, right? But that's also a big leap to saying, okay, I'm actually going to learn it now.
I think it might be a personality thing as well. I do have a history of being interested in something very small and then spending 8 years at university learning it. Like I went on to do a PhD in meteorites when I could have just watched more Deep Space Nine, saved myself some time. So with Chinese, it just felt like I would so love to be able to speak this language. And I think because of all the experiences I had in China, just thinking back to all those interactions I had, if only I had been able to speak Chinese in any of those interactions, it would have made everything so much different. None of the problems that we had would have happened. We would have been able to express ourselves, to ask people for help. It would have been a completely different experience. And I felt really regretful of, gosh, these 3 times I had all those opportunities and I didn't use them at all. So it was a bit of regret with a bit of excitement that I can do this in the future, a bit of I really love a challenge, and just seems like the most difficult language, and I really wanted to accept that challenge.
I like hearing your story here. It sounds like the challenge is probably a sense of achievement and accomplishment. What's interesting also about your story is that you spent time in China, but it wasn't until afterwards you decided to learn the language. So I'm curious to know, like, what are some things that you've done along the way that you feel like have been perhaps the most beneficial to improving your Chinese?
The most beneficial for me is finding a teacher on italki. So initially, I had found a teacher that used to come to my workplace and we'd do 90 minutes every week. But COVID happened around about that time, so we only had a couple of lessons. Then I was trapped at home. We weren't able to go anywhere. And I was really feeling like, I was just starting to get into this Chinese. I really wanted to keep that momentum going. So I found out about italki, went on there, watched a few of the introductory videos, got some courage to finally do a class. I was so terrified in that first class. And then just started having regular lessons with one teacher. So I had a professional teacher teaching me through grammar structures and just explaining why the language is the way it is. And then I started chatting to some community teachers just for a pure hour of conversation. That first year or so, I hadn't really used teachers. I was just learning all the basics myself and just learning vocabulary. But I realized I still had no way to express myself. I couldn't even say one sentence. I just knew random bits of vocabulary. But as soon as I started engaging with a teacher, speaking with a native, it came so much quicker, and it was definitely the quickest way that I made improvement.
Can you think of any breakthrough moments you had during that process?
Confidence was one of the problems I had. I had one particular community teacher and I loved spending time with him. He was so good at keeping the conversation moving. We didn't speak any English at all, but I felt like I must be his worst student. And I could imagine every time I was booking a class, I had a pang of pain, thinking, I'm so sorry, I'm subjecting you to me again for an hour. He must hate this. We got on really well, but I thought he's just such a professional. He makes it feel like we have a good relationship going here. About 6 months later, I was just mentioning, I have this language partner, but he speaks English all the time. I'm not really learning anything. And he said, actually, my boyfriend is learning English. Would you be interested in doing a language exchange with him? So I could not believe that he was willing to subject the person he cared about most in the world to my Chinese. So it gave me huge confidence in, he doesn't think I'm that terrible and I can go and talk to this other guy. So every Sunday we'd spend, it was meant to be an hour, but we talk for about 2 hours now, just chatting about anything under the sun. So the three of us have become really good friends now.
Wow.
Totally invested in each other's lives. And it's just crazy to think that like thousands of miles away, there's two Chinese people like discussing the trivial details of my life. Having those relationships that you'd never imagine that you could possibly have means a lot to me. And as soon as I can go to China, I will be heading straight to see them.
Well, that's really neat. That's really neat. I think what you're highlighting is a common feeling among pretty much all Chinese learners. Like, do you know Chinese? Just a little bit, right? It's like no matter how much you study, it's like you've been going through lessons and your Chinese was probably better than what you thought it was, right?
Yeah.
What I really think is interesting, Christina, is like you have like a real relationship with these people that you're using the language or the modem of communication. And so that makes it a little bit more real and alive.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that for me is the biggest motivation. If I was still just studying books and just studying vocabulary and grammar, it wouldn't really mean a whole lot. But to actually have people in your life that you consider friends, that you consider like almost like family, you're like really interested to see how they are and you're really rooting for them and different goals and aspirations they have in their lives. It really brings it to another level in that now I'm not too concerned about, am I going to be fluent in however many years? It's just, I want to talk to these people. I want to get to know them better. I want to be able to understand them better. So it's a really special thing.
That's really important. Gives you a reason to speak, right? It gives you a reason to use the language with people you care about. Well, Christina, is there any way how Chinese has impacted your life? It's been part of your studying and as part of your process, but has it impacted your life or even your career in any other way?
Sure. So at the time when I was learning Chinese, I was working at the British Library as an imaging scientist. So that involved using infrared technology and ultraviolet technology to image manuscripts that had become faded or damaged over time. And a lot of the collections that I was focused on was Western heritage. So things like Magna Carta, the Bodmin Gospels, the Lindisfarne Gospels. So as my interest in China developed, I started thinking, we have all of these Asian collections. I should really be looking at the other incredible collections that we have. So one of the projects that I worked on was in collaboration with the British Museum. And prior to 1973, the British Museum and the British Library were one institution, but they decided to split the collections into two separate institutions. Part of that separation, they had to make some decisions about which collections belonged where. And one of the problems that they came across was coins were very clearly British Museum collection items, but they also had some paper money from China, which they thought, oh, this is actually paper, so maybe this should go with the paper conservators to the British Library. So we had a project where we were going to do some microscopy on these paper money notes to see what exactly they were made of. As soon as we heard this is an opportunity to do this, it was just music to my ears. I was absolutely delighted to partake in it and be involved in any way at all. So it was really very interesting.
Christina, there's also something I wanted to ask you about. I recall there was some situation in the British Library, you have some ancient Chinese documents and there's some fly embedded in there. You have to tell me about this.
Oh, so this was a copy of the Lotus Sutra. So one of my main roles is if any of the conservators are conserving a document for digitization, they need to make sure that it's clean, that it's in good condition for the digitization process. And if they come across anything unusual, any illegible text or something that they're not quite sure, should it be in the final digitized item or not, they will come to me to make a decision on it. And in one particular case, for this Lotus Sutra, they found a little fly embedded on the surface.
It just squashed right onto the manuscript, right?
Just squished, yeah. It was on a scroll, so it looked like it had just landed in there. Maybe it was having a little nap and then someone rolled the scroll up. And then it was trapped there forever and the poor thing died in this manuscript. So we were not sure whether this is contemporary to the manuscript or is this a London housefly or...
5 years old or 500 years old, right?
Exactly. And things like that, when they become embedded and when they're there for a significant amount of time, you know, they become part of the history of the object. So you don't want to just take off the fly just because the picture is a bit clearer. So at that point, we decided it is part of the manuscript at this point. So we did some microscopy on it, got some amazing pictures and sent them off to try and determine what species it was. And it was some kind of an Asian fly, but we weren't able to date when that fly did actually live upon the manuscript.
Wow, that's cool. So a potentially ancient Asian fly in the manuscript.
Yes. Yeah.
I'm curious to know, you've seen those documents too. And I know anciently, having good handwriting was a way to getting a good job within the government. How was that handwriting there compared to what you're seeing in modern fonts and so forth? And was anything you were able to read, or was your Chinese able to be useful in working with any of those documents? My
Chinese was useful in terms of doing multispectral imaging. So one of the parts of my job is if something has been erased, then you can do multispectral imaging. It will provide a data set and you can run several algorithms on that data set to try and enhance whatever ink is left or remove any noise away from it. So if you don't have an understanding of what the original writing system is, you're not sure which parts of the image you're meant to be, which bits are noise, which bits are not noise. So having an understanding of the stroke pattern really helped me out a huge amount, because I knew, oh, well, this has to be going in this direction because that's how they would write this particular component. The handwriting in the manuscripts that we had was impeccable. As you said, it really took you back in time. You could imagine writing each character out by hand. It's really beautiful to look at. I think Chinese has also influenced my current role. So I'm now changed careers. I now work in AWS as a content strategist. And when I was applying for that role, I really had in mind that I wanted a job that I could work at home from. So the team that I'm working on now is the global documentation team, and we provide documentation and training support to the data centers. And there are already existing data centers in China, and I've already started to develop some relationships with the cluster managers there. So it's something that I'm focusing now. It's my next goal, and my vocabulary is very much data center related.
Wow, that's really interesting. I've talked to a lot of other individuals who've had those similar experiences, and it's not always as if Chinese is essential, right, to that job sometimes, but it makes those connections and it deepens those connections with different people in the teams, company, and partners and things like that.
Yeah, but even in the few interactions I've had, where there's been a few documents that I've worked on that have come through the Chinese data centers, and just being able to Slack them in Chinese, it just made the conversation a whole lot easier and everyone relaxed. And there's a huge change when people realize that you can speak their native language, and it just really makes everything more interested and makes me more motivated every time I use Chinese in real life.
Christine, I guess it's 4 years roughly you've been learning Chinese. If you could go back and you could do anything differently, what would you do?
I think I would stop waiting to be ready. A lot of the time, people would say, oh, when I've reached HSK 4, maybe then I'll get a teacher, or when I've had a teacher for a year, then maybe I'll go and do a course in China, or when I've done a course in China, then maybe I'll go and move to China. If you have a goal that you really want, just go straight for the goal. Cut out the middleman, just do it. Just don't be afraid. Get that teacher. If you're nervous to get a teacher, just get a teacher. If it doesn't work out, you can get a different teacher. So just don't be shy, accept the challenge, and just enjoy yourself.
And what advice would you give to someone who's starting to learn Chinese right now?
I would say find a community of Chinese learners. It's incredibly motivating and normalizes what can seem like a crazy endeavor if your social circles are aligned to your own goals. So even if that's not in a classroom situation, but you can find that kind of support and community online. There's one particular teacher on YouTube now called Richard Learning Chinese. He lives in Taiwan, and every single day at the same time, 10:30 Beijing time, he does a live broadcast class. And in the class, it's the same students that go to the class, and it's not even the content. His content is great, but what's so good is the community. It's the same people that come to watch the class. It's the same people that are in the chat box talking to each other, and he puts up these exercises and we all answer, and everyone knows who everyone is, and some people have become friends on WeChat afterwards. So I think finding that kind of accountability, getting your accountability buddy on side is really useful, having that friend to know that you're not alone in this long journey.
There's an African proverb. It's like, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together.
Exactly.
You know, sometimes we don't give ourselves credit for our progress, but I'm certain you've had some opportunities to maybe use Chinese. I mean, there's Chinese people everywhere, all over the world, right? And maybe have some little wins. Do you have any experience like that?
There was one particular situation where I realized, oh, maybe I have actually learned more than I thought. I was in Dublin just before Christmas, and I was in a bookshop looking for some gifts for my friends and family. And down the back of the shop, there was a secondhand book section, and they had a language section. They seemed to have every single language, but I couldn't find any Chinese books. So I asked the server, I was just looking in your language section. I couldn't see any Chinese. Do you have any? And she said, we do. Actually, we have maybe 20 or 30 books, but they're out the back. We haven't had time to put them out yet. But if you're interested, I can go and get them for you. So living in Dublin, where there's very limited Chinese reading material, I said, I will take whatever you have. Bring them all out. Bring them all out. So she goes out the back, and about 15 minutes later, comes back carrying this big pile of books, and I take a look, and the first one is Japanese. I was like, I'm really sorry, this one's actually Japanese. And then she's like, I'm really sorry about that, really sorry. And then I look at the second one, and it's Japanese, and they're all Japanese. And I just realized, like, to me it was so obvious. I was like, this is obviously Japanese. How can you not tell the difference between Chinese and Japanese? And then it just hit me that I had no idea what the difference between these were 4 years ago, and that kind of made me realize you have actually come a long way, and maybe things that you think are not obvious today and really challenging today, maybe in another 4 years they'll be so obvious. How did you not know this was not the way? So every little step counts.
It's one of those little seemingly insignificant milestones along the way, but you realize, wait, I do know something. Maybe I can make sense of this language.
Yeah.
Christina, this has been really great. I really appreciate you taking the time to share your story. And everyone's story is so different. I really appreciate you taking the time.
It's been an absolute pleasure, Jared. I love your podcast, and I really encourage everyone to keep learning Chinese. You can learn Chinese.
You have been listening to the You Can Learn Chinese podcast. Help us spread the word by sharing this with your friends, classmates, teachers, cousins, philanthropists, pitmaster, chiropractor, swimmer, shoveler, planter, and that one guy named Frederick. You can subscribe in iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. And please write us a review so we know how we're doing. You can find us on Facebook or at MandarinCompanion.com or tag us on social media, #MandarinCompanion. Apologies to John Cena, we just ran out of time. You Can Learn Chinese podcast is produced by myself, Jared Turner, and our editor is Kaiser Kuo. Our interview editor is Dominic Edgley. I'd like to thank our special guest, Christina Duffy. And of course, thanks to my co-host, the man, the myth, the legend, John Paston. See you next time.